2021 marks the centenary of the internment camp in Bere Island. The camp was located at Rurin Military Barracks, or Fort Berehaven as it was then known. The camp operated from April 1921 to December 1921, and at one stage there were up to 284 interned here. The camp and its buildings are long since gone. The memories and the stories of those men continue to this day. This film, which was produced by Bere Island Produce Group, will tell the story of the men who were interned here, their families, and the impact that those internees and the camp had on Bere Island and its community. The film was funded by the Heritage Council's Community Heritage Grant Scheme. Thank you and welcome to Bere Island.
So Padraig O'Shukru, who was better known as An Shawak, was interned here for most of 12 months. In his papers he left us a map of the prison, and this building, the drill hall, is quite clear to be seen in that map. There were two other very large buildings here, both which blew away in storms, hurricanes in the 1970s, and on the other side of the road there were buildings as well. Just beyond the bunkhouse here there was a wire fence, and then beyond that again was another wire fence leading into the prison, the internment camp.
From 1919 and 1921, Ireland experienced what we call the War of Independence, which was an insurgency against the British state in order to achieve Irish independence. Insurgency for the first year and a half was relatively peaceful and nonviolent, but by about mid-1920, basically an armed insurgency spearheaded by the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, began to undertake a guerrilla campaign against the British administration of Ireland, assisted by the Republican women's organization called commemorate. As that campaign escalated into the late 1920 and early 1921, the British brought in numerous troop reinforcements and police reinforcements, and they began to arrest and detain Irish Republican Army activists. The British Army began to operate prisoner of war camps, essentially, for both convicted prisoners and people who were interned under special emergency powers. The internment camps were centered in isolated places, initially at the Curragh, also in Ballykinler, Bike Island, and Bere Island. And the idea was to keep these prisoners together, isolate them, and basically prevent escapes, prevent them from having easy access to the outside. An island like Bere Island was a perfect venue for that, especially since there was a British military garrison already here, and facilities could be easily transferred to creating a detention area.
Late 1920, the prisoners, the convicted prisoners here, we can't actually establish what date they came, but on the 15th of April 21, a shipload of detainees, internees, were brought to Bere Island, and the same ship took away the convicted prisoners back to Spike. Most of them were IRA activists, but some of them were completely innocent people who were just rounded up and in the wrong place, wrong time. Of course, they came in innocent and having nothing to do with it, and they left convinced and absolutely devoted to the cause.
One of the interesting things about the camp that was out here, and it's similar to the other camps, is that basically it was prisoner run and prisoner dominated. So the camps were basically fully militarized under IRA control. And so basically what you had was you had huts and a number of prisoners in each hut, and they basically had a command structure, and they had a hut leader, and then each hut basically reported to like a camp committee, like a camp commandant, who was an IRA officer. The camps would have things like orchestras, you'd have a lot of matches, there was big GEA populations as well, but you would also have things like classes. And you know, some of the best known prisoners here, Professor Alfred O'Reilly, who at that time was the registrar at UCC, or was he the bursar at UCC?
I think he was registrar
at UCC. Yeah. He was here. A really well-known Irish teacher and author called An Shawak was here as well. And what you'd also have is you'd have people like Alfie O'Reilly giving lectures in French or in history or mathematics or in Irish.
And once the truce was declared, every Sunday they put on a variety show at the fence, and all the locals came and sat in an embankment outside the prison and watched this. And just to prove that they weren't without culture, they would have organised their own particular little items, and they would play them, and the prisoners would watch. And so that went on from the truce, which was in July, right through until they were released in December. Quite a big population on the island at the time, well over 1,000 people. A large number of people would gather at the edge of the prison. And of course they would throw things in and things would be thrown out. And it was a military prison in the field was what was called. And there was a standard MPIF document that the British Army used everywhere they were, all over the world. The kind of discipline of the MPIF broke down because the truce meant that, everybody's been careful not to kill anybody or in any way endanger the truce, because there were a number of people in Spike, for example, who were under sentence of death, convicted prisoners. And if the truce broke down, they were going to be executed. So these were their colleagues and their friends, and they didn't want them getting executed, so they were being very careful not to break the truce. But at the same time, that didn't stop them escaping. So you were saying these were secure locations. Actually, this location turned out not to be secure.
So one of the so if we think about Bere Island, so the population was about 1,000, 1,100 at the time, and there was a very big British military presence on that end of the island. And you had military batteries, and there was also, think about the First World War, this would have been absolutely packed full of British and American warships and what have you. So the island population would have been, many people worked for the British administration, would have worked on that side of the island, or what have you. That being said, one of the most remarkable things I find, especially as a historian who studies this period, is the high level of IRA membership and common membership on the island. So again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's around 35 or 40 members. Islanders were in the IRA company here, and about 20, 25 members were in Common Amman. And also because the British administration and the British Army and the British government continued to occupy the forts on the edge of the island, there was a lot of silence around this because people, for years afterwards, because people felt that they might be risking pensions or employment or what have you, had their service in the IRA and Common Amman become better known. So as a result of that, there's not as much written about it. People were being deliberately quiet in order to protect people who had undertaken that kind of service in the War of Independence years.
When we were trying to identify the Common Amman members, I went to the son of the lady who was the second in command of the Common Amman and presented him with the list, and he said, "Oh, that's a very interesting list, Common Amman list." He said, "But much more interesting are the people who didn't want their names on it." This was a shock to me. Why would nobody want their name on it? This was 1936, those lists were compiled. Right. And I said, well, what's this about? They could have got a pension or something out of this. And he said, that was 1936. The British didn't leave till 1938. Right. Some of these people were even still, at that time, working for the British.
This was a small prison population for the first number of months, probably about 100. Yeah. And then, would you say it was about 200 by the summer and autumn of 1921?
Alfred O'Reilly says 284 when he left.
And that must have been the height. That was the
absolute
highest. But you're comparing to places like Ballykindler, I think, was probably closer to 2,000, probably at least 1,000 in the Curragh. And those would have been much bigger camps. And you have a much more diverse population. You would have had easier to mix and find your own people, but a smaller group, you can, if you don't like somebody, there's no hiding from them.
Absolutely.
It's a smaller ground. It's also like, I'm from California, man. It's like winter out here is rough.
Alfred O'Reilly found it particularly difficult, and he wrote a famous poem about it in an autograph book. And in fact, that's one of the things which gives the impression of what the prisoners thought about it. We have a number of autograph books signed by the prisoners. It was kind of a fashion at the time. And some of them thoroughly enjoyed their time here, right? One guy said to me when I interviewed him in the 1980s, he said, "I wonder was that guy Billy Butler never interned, the guy who invented the holiday camp, or where did he get the idea?" Right? Now, he had a ball, right? But you read through the autograph books and you can see that some of them really had a great time and others hated every minute of it. But the weather was particularly good in 1921. Right. August, September in particular were hot and dry, and they were taking swimming every day. So some of the prisoners learned to swim there. Peter Hagerty, who became a TD for East Cork afterwards, swam every day in the sea after he went back home. You know, some guys enjoyed it. There was a, you know, a bit of danger, good company, and a whiff of gun smoke, I suppose.
And so when we look at people who escape, you know, sometimes people are escaping because they're patriots and they want to get back in the fight. Sometimes people are escaping because they just can't handle it anymore. Yeah. They're in prison and they don't want to be in prison anymore. Yeah. And so one of the things about Bere Island, which makes it different from the other camps, is there were a large number of escapes here. The first escape proper occurred officially in the War of Independence, I think on the 10th of July, a day or two before the truce was declared between the Irish and British governments. That one was it six or six? And so,
although the prisoners do say 7 in a number of autograph books, the locals here are adamant that 6 only escaped. But
and it was basically the camp compound was basically there was an internal camp where the huts all were, and some of the other support buildings, and that was fenced in and patrolled. And then you had an outer perimeter, which was more connected to the British military camp that was already there. Pretty much all the escapes. The big thing was getting out of the inner perimeter. If you got out of the inner perimeter into that outer perimeter, the outer perimeter really wasn't patrolled. So the first big escape, the inner perimeter was kind of ringed with like a big trench. And it wasn't sure if was that used maybe as a practice trench for the First World War as training?
Yeah, we think it was left over from that. I think in Machnamh Kimma, Padra Honercoin suggests that it was left over from the First World War. Yeah.
And so what they realized was that could be a good hiding place for a number of prisoners who could basically wait there until night when the sentries were kind of withdrawn, and then you could work your way out that way. So what they did was they basically dug a kind of a cave in the side of this trench. And it sounds like it was kind of clay, dirt. And the way they did it was they would basically have kind of dirt wars with kind of clay, like balls of clay. And they would wing those at each other, and they'd kind of be organized, and they would kind of do it as a form of recreation, except that the real intention was to dig out a hole and to get rid of the clay. So they basically were pretending that they were have these pretend mock wars with throwing clay balls at each other, and the whole time they're just excavating, and they were building a deeper and deeper hole. And eventually, after a couple of weeks of doing this, they had a deep enough kind of cavern that they could fit 6 or 7 people. And they also they built a canvas thing with turf on top of it too.
They covered it over with
covered it over.
Yeah.
So what they did was they waited till one of these big exercise was going on. And how did they actually get inside?
I think they waited till the two compounds.
They went out at night. They went out at night.
They went out at night,
yeah.
And so the recreation compound would be closed. The guards just closed the recreation compound gate and didn't bother checking. And so the guys were hiding inside there.
Right.
And then out they went.
Yeah, so they hid, and then they hid there until basically till the guards were withdrawn, and then they shimmied underneath the perimeter, kind of the inner perimeter wire, and then made it to the outer perimeter and got out that way. And they had a signal. One of their fellow prisoners who was inside one of the huts had his Irish pipes. The coast was clear. He played the pipes, and that's when they knew the coast was clear. And then they had a friendly ex-RIC retired police, or was he?
I've read that in the account, and we cannot identify.
You can't identify who it was.
Is. And we wonder if that person actually existed.
Okay.
But they were met by 4 volunteers from the local company.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. Like if we go through that account and we've walked the East End and there was no ex-RIC man that we can identify that was there, and they gave the name, actually, which is a common name enough around here, is Harrington.
Right.
And in fact, there is no Harrington's house you can see from where the prison was. We must also remember that the people working for the British War Department, when they were dealing with the prisoners, they did not give them their real names in case, they were carrying in and out messages, but in case anybody squealed afterwards, they had the wrong names.
And like all prisons too, they created pretty good communications channels, maybe through chaplains or maybe through people delivering food packages or things like concerts. And so it wasn't hard for messages to be smuggled out to the IRA and coming them on the island and then connecting to the mainland. So the so it appears that this was a very prepared escape. When the men made their way out at night, got to the outer compound, got their way through, they were met. They were taken down
To the shore.
to the shore where a boat was waiting for them, and then they were rowed out, and then kind of taken.
They were actually hidden under a seine net in the boat, and there were 4 men rowing. It was a big seine boat. These were rowboats that were quite large.
There wasn't only sentries and British troops at the end of the island. The harbor was full of British warships.
Yes.
There were destroyers and patrol vessels with spotlights. There were troops and Castletown Bere. I mean, this was a heavily militarized stretch of water. Those folks managed to escape, and the prisoners in the huts basically were able to hide. So every kind of day, morning and evening, the prisoners would be counted, and you have a count. It wasn't that difficult for prisoners in one hut to be counted, and then to figure out, have a way out, like probably through a floorboard, and to shimmy out and then crawl over to the next hut and be counted a second time. And so these guys were able to be double counted for a number of days. So it took them a long time to figure out that they were actually gone. And that gave the prisoners obviously enough time to get up, and they were in Cork City within a day or two. So that was the first big escape.
And it was a cause of tremendous glee to the prisoners. It really lifted their spirits. I mean, you read Machnamh Cimma and you can see the joy jumping off the pages when you read it. So there were 3 individual escapes. The first one, I suppose, was Sean Biogo Mahuna was the name he went by. He was about 4'6", and what they did was they put him into a bag with the kitchen waste, put the bag up on top of the truck by distracting the guards, and the fella taking out the waste sat actually on top of him, right? And he's put up with it as long as he could until he couldn't stick it any longer, and he just screeched. But they were already halfway down the village, but he frightened the living daylights out of the guy in the truck. And somebody, I don't know who, spotted what was happening and immediately intervened, and they took him back to the people who were taking the kitchen waste were rearing pigs, feeding pigs, and they took him back as far as there and spirited him away. I suppose the best organised one was the Mort O'Connell escape. He was considered important. They wanted him for the truce.
He was more of a political leader.
He was, really, and recognised by the prisoners immediately as a leader when he arrived. They were on a swimming parade. The weather was beautiful, and they went down to the rifle range, beautiful little beach there, and they go there swimming every day. A lot of the prisoners learned to swim there, and they were on the way back. And the local company of volunteers had a guy in a barn, and when the prisoners arrived, he flung some dung at them, and by pre-arrangement, they all started throwing dung in every direction. Good old-fashioned dung fight. And as soon as the dung fight started, Mort O'Connell jumped through a fence into where there was a barn just beside the road. There were 2 men in the barn waiting for him, and they went in, hid inside there until everybody moved past. Machnamh Cimma says 2 people escaped, but the locals are quite adamant. Mary Mullins, who was the district nurse afterwards, she witnessed the whole event. She said 1 person came through the fence. As soon as they passed, they brought him down to the shore, put him into a seine boat, rowed him out the south side of the island here out to the mainland, had a pony and trap waiting, brought him into Castletown and put him on the Princess Bere. It pulled into Lawrence's Cove, and he was standing at the railing. It's the best place to hide, of course, in plain sight. And they were checking and double checking everybody getting on the steamship because they were convinced he was still on the island. 2 days later, he was in Dublin Castle, and they were still searching the island looking for him, and he was negotiating with the British in Dublin Castle. And to get him from Bere Island to Dublin at that time in 1921 was a massive operation, and it just showed the level of sophistication.
The organisation that
had arrived at that point.
Absolutely, and so, couriers and messages, and so then what was the third one?
The third one was Donald Barrett.
Yeah.
Donald Barrett was one of those people who had enough of the prison. He was just fed up with it, right. And he says that himself. He was quite well known in Cork. There's a famous photograph of Tomás McCurtain, Terence McSweeney, Tig Barry.
Yeah, they're in an alleyway. Yeah. It's a really well
known. And he's standing in the middle at the back.
Yeah.
So he was one of the key people in Cork during the War of Independence. And what he did was he pretended to be sick and was moved to the infirmary. Classic, all the war movies. You see the guy escaping from the hospital, and he went out the window and headed down the village, and he walked down the village and knocked on the first door he came to, which was a bad mistake. It was actually the captain of the MacHardy, which was a British War Department vessel. And then he went from there, talked his way out of that one, rousing suspicion, and went in next door into the pub. And 2 of the ladies in the pub were in the coming man. and guessed he was an escaped prisoner. So she immediately intervened and brought him through the house. Their living quarters were upstairs. They had a sitting room up over the pub, and there was a bedroom alongside that, and somebody was ill in bed. They brought him into the bedroom, put him lying between the bed frame and the mattress. Immediately the British had found he was missing out of the hospital, the infirmary. They called out the guard, searched all the houses, came into the pub, went upstairs, looked in the sitting room, and there was the Captain Martin, the officer in charge of the prison, playing cards. And so they really didn't look in that room, and they looked under the bed in the next room and looked around and didn't see anybody and went away. And then there was a funeral in the island, and a lot of people came in from the mainland for the funeral, and people from the village went to the funeral, and then he went out with people who came to the funeral and escaped that way.
We also have we have a map that was on Shawag's papers that appears to show tunneling. Yeah. Basically, the red line seems to show tunnels.
The tunnel.
And it sounds like the tunneling was unsuccessful because of rocks or stones or what have you.
Yeah. Now, Tom McNamara, who was the barrack foreman of works here under the Irish from 1938 on, he told me that the tunnel came out, that it actually got beyond the outer fence, although Padre Honecoin says that it didn't.
The logistics would be really difficult too. I mean,
yes.
You talked in, so there was
200 guys.
200 guys, and how do you get them off the island?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a big, about 100 people had tunneled out of the Curragh, and but that was a totally different animal. What are you supposed to do with this? You know,
there's one thing to get out, it's another thing to get off the island.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would have been extremely difficult. But it raised their spirits. It gave them great hope. The tunnel itself. There were, according to local folklore, a number of guys from Allihies who were copper miners who were put into the prison.
The last big escape was in kind of early November 1921, and which is only 6 or 8 weeks before all the prisoners were released. It was basically, there was a prison washroom, and between the floor and the foundation was a few feet, and that fit about 6 people. Was that what the number was?
Well, there were 8 got out. There were 6 in. They were got out in 2 groups, 6 and 2.
Okay.
Okay. So there were 8 people in total.
And basically, same thing. You're waiting until nightfall. You're waiting until the sentries are gone. Mm-hmm. And they had also worked on creating a small, not quite a tunnel, but they had hollowed out the ground underneath a gate, again, that separated this inner compound, this inner patrolled compound, from this outer unpatrolled compound. And at night they were able to scoot through and make their way out that way. But that seemed to have been, were people waiting for them on the outside?
There was nobody waiting for them.
Right.
In fact, the 6 got out quite easily, right? The 2 got stuck in the barbed wire, the outer fence, and it took them some hours. And they eventually, it was almost dawn when they got to a house, and they were bleeding profusely. And they just happened to knock on the right door, because if they'd knocked on the houses just before that, they would have been in trouble. And a young lad, whose father was actually under arrest at the time, went and got a neighbour, and they took those 2 guys to the mainland. That was John Culhan and Peter Hagerty. And they brought him out across to the mainland and came back. And
the 6 had gone out and gotten in their own boat.
The 6 had gotten out and made their way, in fact, to a house of an individual who had been in 1916 Rising in Dublin, right? I mean, talk about picking the right house,
right.
Okay? But I think they knew that. I think they knew which house was safe. It had been pointed out to them.
One thing we should keep in mind is that there was constant messages coming in and out of the camp, because the camp itself wasn't totally isolated. No. You had work people, islanders typically, coming in and doing kind of normal maintenance.
Yes. And
you also had things like, again, we talked about not just the priest who was coming in to say mass, but the altar boys.
Yes.
So basically, the prisoners and island Republicans on the island created channels, communication channels, where it was, you get messages in and out, and also like getting news in.
Yeah.
And that was important because by the autumn of 1921, there was also a series of protests by the prisoners over their conditions.
Yeah.
And those protests were getting national and international press, and the prisoners were able to monitor the reaction outside the prison. When he explained how that was going, how the news was coming in sometimes.
Well, there were numerous ways. There was one lady developed a system for baking loaves of bread with newspaper inside it without burning the newspaper.
That's a great baker.
A great baker. And so there were loads sent in loaves of bread. You know, who suspected a loaf of bread was carrying a newspaper? So that was one way that they got information.
Food parcels also were coming in too, and so it's pretty easy to get messages in. Just you roll them up really tight or what have you, right?
So also the guy who was in charge of the fire prevention, he would bring in dry buckets of sand every couple of days because they were very worried. They were timber huts, they were very fragile, and these guys all smoked like chimneys, right? I mean, tobacco was a big issue.
Right.
So the place was a complete fire hazard, fire trap even, and so they were very worried about this. So he brought in buckets of sand, and the buckets of sand, of course, contain a lot more than sand. You know, even brought in bottles of whiskey in these, you know, for medicinal purposes, of course. Another case in point was the Canon O'Kennedy episode, where Canon O'Kennedy was being kept in total isolation, solitary confinement in the Loner Battery, and they wouldn't admit they even had him there. They wouldn't say where he was. They said that, oh, he escaped, he's gone, that he'd run away with a woman or something. He'd been arrested above in Flannan's College in Ennis. Eventually, after much protesting, he was allowed an altar boy to serve Mass, but he could have no contact with the altar boy. So the altar boy's father was principal of National School and was to train the other altar boys with the Latin responses of the day. So he gave the altar boy a Latin phrase to say at the end of the Mass, basically, who are you and what are you doing here? And so he did that, and Canon O'Kennedy answered back in Latin, and the young fellow brought back the message to his father, who then communicated to the local captain of the IRA, volunteers here, who passed the message up and back to Flannan's in Ennis. And the Bishop Fogarty of Killaloe came down to Bere Island, did so secretly, came in and hid in a house. Now, Canon O'Kennedy was allowed to go for a swim on his own, with nobody. Guards weren't allowed to talk to him, but they took him to a separate beach, small little beach way down the north side of the island, very remote, allowed to have a swim there and brought back. So they were coming back this day, and a lady in the house they were passing, it was a really hot day, said, I have cold drinks here for you, put that fella down the room there, I know you're not allowed to talk to him. And so she gave the British soldiers who were guarding him some cold drinks to cool them down, and he went down the room, and hidden down the room was Bishop Fogarty, who interviewed him, got all the details, and then they moved on, took Canon O'Kennedy back to the prison, back to the solitary confinement, and Bishop Fogarty went back up to Killaloe, where he was bishop, and the following Sunday he wrote a letter which was read out of every church in the diocese, and of course it burned the British administration. It was a complete own goal, a propaganda coup for the volunteers and a disaster for the British.
By the end of 1921, the British and Irish governments negotiated a treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and as part of that agreement, January 1922, prisoners were being released,
Yes.
and the camps being closed.
Yeah, the internees here were released in December.
Okay.
On I think the first lot were released on the 8th of December. Curiously, when they came for the first lot to release them, some of them had already escaped. They were looking for guys to release, and they'd already left.
That kind of prison service was a badge of honor.
Yes.
It was seen as a real patriotic sacrifice that you made. And when prisoners were released from here, as they were in the Curragh or Ballykindler, normally when they arrived home, there would be big parades for them and bonfires and
local heroes.
Local heroes, and people kind of processing them home.
Yeah.
Because there's the service of being out with a flying column and being out in the hills and doing all that. And then there's just giving up a year of your life when you're in your early 20s or whatever, and sitting it out under armed guard, trying to hold it together, and that takes a different kind of courage and a different kind of national service.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So, but I don't think it was a hardship for most of the younger guys who were like 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. They kind of enjoyed it.
I don't know.
And this camp, there wasn't anybody killed here. Like Ballykindler, you had Tig Barry was shot. There were other people wounded.
Right.
In Spike, you know, they were hurt. There was Captain
there were a
White
couple
was
killed.
shot.
There were a couple
There were a
kills,
number
but-
of guys killed. They were treated very badly. They were put into the moat for a couple of nights
Yeah.
in bad
Yeah.
weather. They were shot at in the moat. Some of them got wounded. Some of them died of wounds that they got. That wasn't here. You know, it was a more I won't say liberal regime, because they did have strikes.
A bit more humane.
It was much more humane. Prison commander at one stage jumped into the sea and rescued a guy who was drowning, right? And this raised his status completely among the prisoners. In his uniform, just threw off his jacket, jumped straight in and hauled them out.
100 years ago, the camp on this island was briefly international news. It was part of this kind of untold, a kind of a hidden history of the Revolutionary period, which is incarceration.
Yes.
But it's important to remember it. So I think hopefully people will.
Very welcome to Bere Island this morning. And on behalf of the projects group, I would like to welcome you all here. Today we are unveiling a plaque to commemorate the presence of the internment camp here on the island. This plaque was funded by Cork County Council through Cork County Council's commemoration grant scheme in 2021. Salute to the Irish flag, and that we will never stop being proud to say that we're Irish. Following the unveiling, members of the Defence Forces and 1 Brigade Artillery Regiment based in Collins Barracks will perform a flag ceremony at the flagpole just opposite. So now Helen and Teresa, can I ask you both to unveil the plaque formally, please? Thank you very much. Okay.